Perfect, perfect. Thank you very much for coming today. It was a huge honor to have you here.
My
I'm
pleasure.
a I'm a huge fan of your work. I read all the books. I love it. I watched
I see the books
all
behind
your
you.
yeah. I watched all your articles. I watched all your conference speeches that you did back in past 6, 7 years at least.
Thank you.
And I didn't exaggerate it when I told on the post that like you had a very big impact to the industry, especially with your books. So yeah, it's a very huge honor to me to have you here and ask you a lot of dummy questions, maybe.
Only dumb answers, so it's for me to to answer properly. I'm very happy to be here, so thank you for having me.
Thank you so much. Can you tell me a bit about your story? How do you start all of this? How do you decide to jump into the video gaming field?
Yeah, mostly serendipity. Yeah, I did not plan at all to work in the game industry when I started my studies. So I have a PhD in psychology, which I had in France, in Paris, because I'm French. And yeah, I studied child development and cognitive
Hmm.
development. And I wanted to do research, but then I found out that research is very dusty in France, and I didn't really like it. And so after my PhD, I wanted to work in a private enterprise, and I started my career in developing toys and games for kids, educational with quote unquote. And so I started at VTech, and they were
Hmm.
working. They're still making toys and games for kids. And yeah, at that point I was like, hey, but I love video games. Maybe I could get into the game industry. Maybe they need me for whatever reason. And back then, there was, that gamification is always like a thing at some point. And back then, it was the early 2000. Ubisoft had a line called Games for Everyone on the DS. And they had
Hmm.
games that were supposed to be more than just for fun. So they had games like My Word Coach, or how to quit smoking and stuff like that. And so I got hired at that moment to work on this and to bring something more than just entertainment. And then I discovered UX, and I was like, oh my god, this is exactly what I could be doing. And yeah, like I said, next serendipity, was very lucky. I was at the right place at the right time.
Right.
So that's
Um, I found a couple of articles that mentioned that you had a chance to work on a Watch Dogs game, Assassin's Creed game,
yeah. I worked
Fortnite,
with
of
the
course, in the
team.
first place.
Yeah, I worked a lot with the teams because at Ubisoft, it was really fantastic because they had this design academy kind of thing. At that
Hmm.
point at Ubisoft, they were inviting all the designers and gameplay programmers and art director for 2 weeks to spend in the Paris area. And the idea is just to make sure to align all the teams about what Ubisoft was trying to do, and to talk about usability and UX. Well, even though we were not calling this UX back then. And through that, so I had a training session to talk about the brain and how the brain works, and what does it mean for onboarding, and overall, like to think about cognitive load and stuff like that. And so through that, I got to meet so many designers at Ubisoft. And so that's how I worked with some of those designers who were working on Assassin's Creed or Watch Dogs, and even more so afterwards when I moved to Ubisoft Montreal, where I worked more closely with the core teams, and more
Hmm.
specifically, 06.
Wow. So you decided to merge cognitive psychology with game design.
It was a thing. I read Don Norman's book, The Design of Everyday
Okay.
Things, and this clicked. And this is when I realized, oh, yeah, I actually have the same background as Don Norman. Is a
Hmm.
cognitivist. and I could apply all these things to the game industry. But UX was not really a term that was used back then. And so that took a little while, but this is, just through discovering all that, this is where I realized that, yeah, this is this is what I'm doing.
This is the thing.
That's the thing. Yeah.
What was the most surprising challenge for you faced when like transitioning from like academia to working in the gaming industry?
The pacing is very different. In academia, everything takes a lot of time. We do careful research. Everything has to be very carefully designed, and we're doing research, and so we take the time, and when you arrived in the game industry, everything is super fast paced. And yes, you're going to do some research, but it's not really to advance research, it's to make a good game. And so the research is not as rigorous as we do in academia, because we just, for the simple reason that we don't have the time, and we don't necessarily also have the means to do the research on enough people to find out very solid results. But it doesn't matter as much. We just need to have good enough research to help the design team and the whole team make decisions and move forward. But doing that transition and understanding that, yeah, it cannot be as rigorous a research as in academia. It takes a little while to get used to, and the pacing of the game industry is so fast paced.
Even now.
It takes a little while to get used to. Like, all right, you need something for yesterday, or okay. But yeah, it's fun.
So then you decided to wrote a book, Gamer's Brain and Gaming Industry, about and also the third one was about the UX. What was the order of you writing all of them? Like, do you have in your mind all of them at once?
No.
Your one book is a continuous is continuing the other one, basically. Like if you read behind the lines, it looks like that they're just another chapter of the book.
Yeah.
The Gamer's Brain is the top one.
Okay.
Right.
It's not as thought through as you might think it is. The Gamer's Brain was obvious to me because it was the summary or the expansion, depending on how you think of it, of my training sessions on the brain and how to apply this to games that I've been doing in the game industry at Ubisoft, at LucasArts, and later on at Epic Games. So I really needed to put it down to, first of all, to help everyone, but also it's a good practice to have all those things that you talk about all the time and write it down. And it happened naturally because I did the first talk called The Gamer's Brain at GDC in 2015 or 16, and the editor came to me, CRC press editor, Sean Connolly, came to me and said, "Hey, do you want to make a book on this?" I was like, "Yes." So this is how it happened. Then the second one, the psychology of video games, is again this as Routledge that called me and say, "Hey, we're doing the psychology of series, and we have ones called the psychology of video games. Do you want to write this one?" I'm like, "Yeah." It was during the pandemic. So yeah, sure, I have time. Let's do this. And the last one, what UX is really about, it's more me. Really wanted to write this book because I see a lot of UX folks who are not necessarily aware of what we're supposed to defend. And also I see a lot of people from outside who think that UX folks are here to make business better or to mind trick people and to, stealing money or to addict them to playing or stuff like that. And it's horrible that people think that way, because the UX folks are the ones who are here to defend humans and put them in forward and before anything else, even though, yes, we have to care about the business goals, and it has to be a win-win situation, because if the business is not working, then there's no product, there's no games, if it's not making any profits. But we are here to talk about things like accessibility and inclusion and ethics. And so it was really important for me to write this book to explain what UX is about, because a lot of people do not know what UX is, and they just talk about UI. And a lot of people don't necessarily know that we are here to make to improve people's lives with technology and games. And so it was really important for me to write it down. And also, it's the kind of book, I wanted to offer the UX folks, so that they, when people are confused about what they're doing, they just could give the book, hey, this is what I'm doing, like, read it. Because sometimes I felt that way, like always having to explain what is it I'm doing, and people are so confused about what UX is about. So
Right.
that's how I wrote this.
You mentioned about UX folks defending the industry, defending the culture, defending the ethics.
Yeah.
Does it also include this trench war between video gaming industry and gambling, and the misconception of these two?
Yeah, absolutely. So that's also the work I'm doing with the initiative called Ethical Games.
Mm-hmm.
We're working with a bunch of folks. So the folks from Thriving in Games, formerly the Fair Play Alliance, and the folks from KU Leuven Digital Society. So these are researchers in Belgium who worked on several things, including loot boxes in games and gambling, and gambling-like mechanics, as we call them in games. To define what are the things that are problematic in games and where we need to be cautious, so that we can offer a great experience and not be harmful to players. And so there are two things. First of all, there is very strong concern from researchers around loot boxes and gambling-like mechanics. And it's been pretty thoroughly researched now, and we can actually say that it's, having loot boxes or gambling-like mechanics where it's serving monetization, and potentially, you can buy them. You buy the in-game currency with real currency, and then you can buy the loot boxes with the in-game currency. We can clearly say that this is problematic for minors. Now, there's a lot of people that take the leap and are saying stuff like that video games are addictive, and they're designed to be addictive for people. And so this is where you have moral panics that enter the scene, and that's meddling a little bit of the discourse there. First of all, for researchers, because we need to have clear understanding of what is harmful, because video games are also great. They are a great platform for kids to meet each other, socialize, and just play. And play is very important for cognitive development and social development. So we need to really separate what is a concern and address the concern from the moral panics, and have a clear understanding between the two. And so this is what is a little bit complicated right now in the discourse, because a lot of people are scared about games still today.
Right.
And yeah, there are concerns, and we need to address the concerns. So that's why it's important to have evidence-based guidelines, so that we can really address the real concerns from the researchers, and hopefully calm down the moral panics and explain, okay, it's not it's not as bad as you think it is, but yeah, we still need to address the concerns.
If we try to give a number or a percentage of people, like the level of fear that people have, what are your thoughts about it? Like, is it bigger number?
It depends on who you're talking to. If you're talking to,
let's talk about Europe, for example. Do we still have
no, but
this
it really
type of
depends on the
trending?
population. If you're talking about parents who never played, or played video games a long time ago, or don't play anymore, and they don't play with their kids, and they don't they're not really tech savvy, or don't have a lot of media literacy, these people are very worried.
Mhm.
And whether it is in Europe or in the US, it's fairly similar. Now, in Asia, there are different concerns. There's less concern about play to play to win, or pay to win. Sorry, pay to win. Whereas in Europe and in North America, this is really not something that is accepted, and there's much more concern around the screen time, and there are some laws in certain countries where kids, they have a moment where they can't play anymore, they have to go to bed, and
Mm.
it's not necessarily very efficient. But there's much more concern around this, and there's more regulations around this. So yeah, there are concerns, and there are lawsuits happening right now with parents who are not happy, and some of the elements are uh, something that we need to address, like punishing disengagement. It's if you force someone to come back to play, because if they don't connect, they're gonna lose something. It's a little bit forcing people to come back. So we
Mm.
need to address those things, but it's not because you have this in the game that we can say
Right.
that it's addictive. And so that's the problem. Like, you have parents who blame video games for everything, where when you talk about addiction specialists, it's most of them are not saying that video games by themselves can create an addiction. When you discuss with them, a lot of time they say, well, yeah, it depends on the context. If there are things going on, or anxiety or depression, or yes, you can fall into pathological gaming because it helps you cope. And so on
Mhm.
top of that, if you have some mechanics in the game that is facilitating this, this is definitely not going to help. Um, but making the leap with addiction by design, it's a
Mhm.
big leap if we go beyond gambling, because gambling has been established as being a problem. And actually, in the DSM, so that's the dictionary of mental illnesses, is the only behavioral addiction that is recognized, gambling.
Oh
So
wow.
we know that this one is problematic, and we need to address it.
Wow, I didn't know about it. Well, in the Middle East, or in a CIS region where I was originally based, like we still have the problem about accepting video games as they are,
Mhm.
because there are two things that like first one, as you said, it's the problem of society,
Mhm.
because they're not tech savvy, they're not media educated in the first place, especially post-Soviet regions. Those regions are regions where there was no enough money, no enough culture, no
Yeah.
enough education most of the time, which causes you having a parenting system or a family institute which is not tech savvy or educated at all. And for them, the misconception between video gaming and iGaming is like very fine. There is a very, very fine line between these two. If you play the games, you automatically get associated with a gambler. You're playing a casino games, doesn't matter if you're playing a story narrative or anything else, you're just playing a gambling. You're a casino.
Yeah.
And you will get punished for that. And the second thing is that like in the region we had multiple gambling heavy companies, tech companies, who are the ones who giving enough workplaces for the countries.
Mhm.
They have either 6,000 or 10,000 workspaces, so they are very popular, and they're using all offline advertising platforms to advertise their products. And since we have this new word, which is iGaming, it became very easy to got confused between these two. And
Mhm.
people, like if they heard about gaming, especially the old people, like the association will be to iGaming, because they see the
Yeah.
casino, there is a gaming, they don't take too much to dig deep to understand what's going on.
Yeah.
And we
Yeah.
have this problem.
Yeah, it's still a problem, and we still have to fight to make sure that video games are recognized as an art form. And so it's not unlike what comic books had to go through to be recognized
Right.
as an art form. But yeah, for video games, it's lingering. We still have to fight for that recognition. But it's at the same time it's complicated because video games started, a little bit like the mafia, where you had like the
Yeah.
first arcade games, and it was all designed to make you like, put more
Money.
dollars in the machine to keep playing.
Yeah.
So it used to be that way, and then once the consoles arrived at home, things changed a little bit. But now, because of free to play games, there are some games that are exploiting some cognitive biases and stuff like that to make people pay more or play more. But we have to distinguish these from piece of art games who can
Yes.
sometimes on top of that have a business model that can be a little bit problematic. Yeah, so there are so many different games, and that's the problem. Like, people put video games in all in the same basket, where
Yeah.
there are as many video games as we have types of food. Um, so we need to better explain what video games are, and that it's not just like a big category. It's actually, there's so many different games, like we have so many different movies or books.
Right. How do you fight it? What is your worst scenario against all of this?
The worst scenario would be to have regulations that are not really taking account of the research.
Okay.
So stuff like what happened in South Korea or in China, where kids under a certain age, they're not allowed to play after a certain time, or they are timed how much they can play, because it's not helping kids if everything is coming from outside, and it's better for kids to learn how to regulate themselves, and to have parents educated on media literacy and video game literacy to help them. So if we have very strong and not adapted regulations, that would be the worst case scenario. The best case scenario is to have some regulations to punish like certain things, like the use of dark patterns, or the use
Hmm.
of gambling, or gambling like mechanics for games that are for kids or are rated E for everyone. And but to have those regulations here, just to make sure that the bad actors out there pay their fair share, because you have
Hmm.
people in the game industry who want to do the right things, don't want to use any of the systems that are punishing disengagement or forcing people to come back, and they are very cautious of this. But since they are widely used, if they don't use it, they are punished somehow for doing the right things. And so if we have regulations that can balance it out, this can help. But those regulations
Hmm.
have to be evidence based, and not
Right.
and not like following moral panics.
But kids became also very like very too much smarter right now.
Oh yeah,
They can
they
find
can,
like
yeah,
they can
find a way.
bypass anything. Yeah,
Yes,
the
that's
same
that's
way
why.
we had the age ratings, right? We had an age ratings which like didn't work at all.
So the age rating is not an obligation. It's really information for parents, so that they can figure out what makes sense for their kids. So it's more about information. It's useful for the parents who know what it is and use it, but a lot of parents don't know about it. And again, it's not, you know you're allowed to buy a game for 18 plus, because there's no regulations behind it. It's a voluntary information. So it's useful for that. But if parents don't know that it exists, and don't have video game and media literacy, it's not gonna help as much as it should be helping. But I wouldn't say that's useless. It's useful, but not everybody knows about it or how to use it.
Right. Video gaming industry right now, it became very massive. And when we're talking about like the games, the culture, the art culture games, uh, it's like 200, 300 people working several years to create the masterpiece. And when it comes to that part, like very recently, we can see that there are a couple of topics that became very popular, and those are fatherhood, parenting,
Mhm.
sibling relationship. For example, like latest God of War series, The Last of Us, Plug Tale. They're becoming very popular, and they're
Yeah.
award-winning video games, which is indicating a growing audience appreciation for these type of stories in the first place. um, and this is the trend that suggests that gaming industry, the big companies, big techs, also started to recognize the importance of diverse narratives that resonate on a personal and emotional levels, right? And what do you think? Why video games are increasingly started to address family dynamics, like parenting, fatherhood, brotherhood, sisterhood? Those are the type of topics that everyone loved, everyone pay extra attention to it, and they're ready to pay. And they're always the kind of topic that you, if you take it as a first place, you as a business will win most of the time.
Yeah, well, we're getting older. The game developers are getting older, and the players, on average, most of the players are over 30 years old. So there it is. Like the audience is there, and as we grow older, we grew up with video games, and today we are ready for for different narratives and different stories, and it's great that this is happening. Yeah, no, definitely. There's yeah, I think it's just because the game industry is maturing, and the gamers are getting older. So
So, like, there is because you've worked with Assassin's Creed, you've worked with Watch Dogs, and they also had a very good storytelling in the first place, in the beginning of their careers, right?
yeah,
Um, what is the average age of players that you notice playing this type of games?
I don't know actually. That's a
Oh
good
wow.
question. I don't know. Yeah, I have no idea. Well, it's probably like older than your typical um game because you have, I mean, the history is so rich. There's a lot of violence as well, so these are not games rated E for everyone. So obviously,
Yes.
it's not for older folks. But yeah, I mean, the story is fairly complicated, and we're talking about history, and we're exploring a lot of interesting stuff, and we're talking about ancient civilizations, and so yeah, it's geared for older players, definitely. But I don't know actually what is the, in fact, in what
Hmm.
is the average. Yeah, you need to ask people
Yeah.
like who work on the Assassin's Creed, and because I
Okay.
was very, I just worked with the developers and worked on certain things. I did not work on the
Hmm.
marketing or business intelligence or
Oh,
any
I
of that. So,
see. But you've also worked with Epic Games.
Mhm.
You've worked on a Fortnite, which is
Mhm.
more in terms of age. I'd say it's more oriented for the kids or teenagers, right?
Yeah, it's more, so it's actually more open to everyone, and there
Okay.
was a real intention to be more inclusive.
Hmm.
So it's not just for younger folks. There's there was an intention to like have this vibe from the 80s, that is for us, in our 30s and
Yeah.
40s, is nostalgic. Like there's reference to Ghostbusters or Back to the Future and stuff like that, and so Yeah, I think it was also clearly like something like a bit nostalgic for the
Hmm.
people in their 30s and 40s. But yeah, there's it's because there's no blood or anything like that. It's more suitable for younger folks. But Fortnite is rated 13 plus, so it's not for kids. It's for teenagers and young adults. But yeah, it turns out like Fortnite was massively popular among the younger kids, and I think it's because it's goofy and it's
Yeah,
not very serious. It's not, it's not military inspired, so it's much more like welcoming
fun.
for everyone. Yeah, well, it's fun. I mean, if you talk to people who play PUBG, they're gonna say it's fun, or Call of Duty, but it's not for everyone. It's the military aspect of it is not necessarily welcoming for everyone. So if you
Right.
remove that, you only have like the aspect of you aim and shoot and you build and everything is goofy and you don't really die, you get beamed out. It's less, it's a bit more lighthearted. Let's say that.
Uh-huh. Speaking of violence, by the way, do you think
Mhm.
violence in gaming is actually the healthy way to someone to release the anger? Is it therapeutic or the opposite?
Um, I mean, so we know we had like decades of research on violent video games. We know that we cannot link playing violent video games to violence in real life. Now, therapeutic, you have some psychologists who are using games as a therapeutic tool. I'm not sure if they're using violent games, but it's possible. So I'm not a clinical psychologist, so it's a little bit
No, I
outside
know.
my, my expertise here. But it's possible that for some kids who are experiencing violence in their real life, just like you have kids who are using dolls gonna be violent on their dolls because they're reproducing what they have experienced. So it's helping them make sense of it. So it's
Hmm.
possible that in certain situations, certain kids can use violent games to make sense of violence they've experienced or they've witnessed. But I wouldn't say that there's a general rule. um, but yeah, we know that violent games is not creating real life violence. So it's still something that we hear in the public space.
Hmm.
Um, but yeah, we have, and again, not all games are violent. Yeah, definitely are some violent games. We are a violent society. So video games are a reflection of our civilization, just like you have violent movies and violent books. Um, yeah. So there's no straight line. I wouldn't say that violent games are necessarily great for for teenagers who need to understand violence in society. But it's not the devil either. So it's more about like going back to the context and who is
Hmm.
playing those games and why. Are they using those games to cope, or is it just the violence is just a mechanic and they don't really think about it more than that. So it really depends. It boils down to why are those players playing those games, and are they playing only violent games or not? It's hard to have a broad rules as when it comes to games and players.
I mean, yeah, for sure. For example, in our region, there is no age restriction working at all.
Mhm.
And there are like two things. I was playing that violent sort of games when I was 12 or 10 because that was the initial list of the basket of games that you're getting with your computer, like Grand Theft
Mhm.
Auto, Medal of Honor, Call of Duty, and Civilization, etc., etc. So these are the traditional basket of games back in that
Mhm.
time that we are getting, like when this Pentium 1, 2, 3 just came out. Uh, but at the same time, I've learned English by playing video games.
Hmm.
I like playing World of Warcraft, for example, by these multiplayer games, by
For the horde,
games
or
like
are you an ally?
yeah, ally.
Okay, I sorry, as more for the horde, but it's okay. We
No,
can still we
it's
can still
fine. We
talk.
still can play, no problem. But still, like there is always an educational aspect in the video games. Also,
Mm.
doesn't matter the level of the violence,
Yeah.
because I know exactly that. Um, if I'm not mistaken, it was a UK-based university that organized this video game playing session for military veterans to like
Mhm.
overcome their PTSDs. So what they're doing, they're playing, shooting military video games to overcome this PTSD situation that they had in
Yeah.
their brain. And like,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
yeah,
So in all these situations, we have to keep in mind that the therapeutic aspect here is
yeah,
is the human that is using that tool to help the vets. It's not if you were just playing a video game by yourself, you're not going to get necessarily this therapeutic
hmm,
outcome. So it's like
okay,
the psychologist here, the psychiatrist, is a key element, and they can use games like other things to help people, but it's more of a tool that they use.
hmm, yeah. From a psychological perspective, how do you respond to misconceptions or backlash about your work, particularly ethical concerns about gamification, implicit bias in video game design? This is one of the questions that our mutual connections asked on
Yeah,
LinkedIn.
yeah, that was a good question because I am confronted to this fairly regularly since I work on Fortnite. I don't know how to solve for that. I think expressing what UX is about and explaining what we're trying to do is really important. But yeah, because people think that the UX researchers or the UX designers or have either PhDs in psychology or know about human factors, they are using this for evil. Uh, and so it's really hard to explain that we're not doing any of that, and oftentimes we don't have a seat at the table where some certain decisions are made, and it's actually hard sometimes for UX designers or UX researchers to raise a flag, because you can easily get ejected from your work if you're being too vocal. So it's not necessarily easy, and I know for a lot of UX folks it feels unfair, um, but I don't know how to solve for that. My way is to answer questions. I'm always happy, unless people are insulting me, then I don't answer. But if people want to understand what my job is about, and I'm always happy to explain all of that. Um, and I don't know how else we can do that. But if that's also the reason why I'm working on the ethical game stuff, because it can really empower the UX folks. If we have a code of ethics and guidelines, then it's easier for us to say, hey, these are the guidelines, and there are some regulations now, and if you don't do that, you
Mm,
risk a fine. Then the discussion internally is much easier to have. Today it's easier to talk about dark patterns in the game industry because of the FTC fine against Epic Games that happened
mhm,
December last year. And there was also concerns about their not protecting kids, and all in all, it was $500 million of fine, and it makes the conversation a bit easier. Like
different.
people,
Yeah.
just like the American with Disability Act made the discussion about accessibility a bit easier. Not saying that that's all everything is won here, but we saw a lot of improvements in terms of accessibility in video games. Also because now there are regulations, and you can also say, hey, if you don't make your game accessible. If there's a communication system in your game and it's not accessible, you're risk of fine. And
Hmm.
sadly, it's making the discussion a bit easier to have internally. Um, so yeah, I don't know how to solve for that, and it can be frustrating at times. But parents and people in the public don't know what they don't know, so it's also important to put that in perspective, so that we can have a calm conversation and respond to concerns. But a lot of times when I chat to parents and they tell me about Fortnite, and are the kids, they're only playing Fortnite, and I'm like, oh, okay, but what mode are they playing? And a lot of parents are incapable of telling me what mode they're playing, which is to me like also a concern. Like, okay, like I understand that video games is not your thing, but it's important for you to understand what your kid is playing, and if they're playing creative mode, it's a very different story than if they're playing battle royale. um,
All
so
right.
there's that focus on screen time and video game time, and not really what are they doing, what are the kids doing, because if they're creative and making stuff and exchanging with their friends, it's not the same thing as if they're just shooting all the time and blowing up faces.
Hmm.
Which again is not necessarily a problem by itself, but it's not the same activity if you are creating something, like in games like Roblox as well, and just
Yes.
like having fun with your friends. So yeah, I think it's really be patient and answering questions, but also understanding that parents don't know anything about games, that people don't know how games are made. We have so many. I think it's Kate Edwards that made that point in one of the roundtables that we participate in, and she was making the point that we have a lot of making of videos for
Hmm.
movies, not for games. Like people don't know how games are made, and so there's that idea that video games are just, I don't know, here to exploit people, or so there's a lot of fantasy around how video games are
Too
made.
much, even
Mm,
too much, with
yep.
like separate agenda to make a propaganda, which also has a place. Like we had a very good examples of propaganda if we look at the past like couple of Call of Duty games, and there
Mm.
was a huge story behind it on. It was Modern Warfare 2. I don't know if you heard about this whole story between Activision and Russian government that they sued them.
Yeah, I've heard some of it, but
Okay.
maybe you know more than me around. So I'm happy to have your your sound, your side of the
Okay.
story. And
Yeah,
I,
the whole story was about one mission in the storytelling campaign
yeah,
where four agents entering the airport and starting Russian airport and starting massive shooting there, and Russian government started to sue them, and they literally banned the game in the region
yeah,
because of that, because it's like anti-Russian like agenda, which repeats sometimes, but like it's also part of the story. Like video games can be used for such matter also. It's not by cause like what they say, what developers say. We're just taking the real life examples and like shaping the stories and trying to tell another story. But after that issue, they had this new trend where they started to change the places. They're not using the real names of countries and regions. And after that, even very recent trend, I don't know the exact lawsuit, but if you're playing military games, most of the time there are games that are not allowed to use weapons' real names. It's like
mm.
the same weapon as in real life, but it calls completely different.
Yeah. So that's why we need diversity, because games are very, like the games we play in the West are very
Yeah.
Western centered,
Yes.
and they're perpetuating tropes. which I mean, it's difficult to have an understanding of the impact of that on people's opinions or whatever, but there's some indication that it might have an impact on how we understand the world, and
Hmm.
just also games where there's a black person, it's always like someone who's doing like coming from a gang or whatever,
Yeah.
or like women that are overly sexualized all the time, or beat them up, or raped, and so when you perpetuate those tropes, it's just establishing certain things, and again, it's not a problem to have these storylines. It's a problem when you don't have any alternative, and it's always the same tropes that are repeated again and again and again. So that's part of the things that we're also thinking about, like thinking about the ethical content of what's in the
Yes.
game and what it is perpetuating, what ideas it is perpetuating, but also what is used for fun. You know,
Mm.
if there's something in the story, like again, we have a lot of movies where the Russians are the bad guys. So it's
Agree.
not just video games, but we have different stories, of course. But in a game, sometimes those tropes are used for fun,
Mm.
um, and so this is where we have to think about the player as a moral agent and the game and what they decide to do. And that was a good example with the uh, airport situation where the player could just there's not much they could do. They could pretend to shoot, but they still had to go through that thing, which it's again it's raising concerns in a different way than movies because we participate in games. And again, I'm not saying that this should not exist. I'm saying we should think about it
Mhm.
and be, a bit conscious of what is it is creating, and yeah, and what is it that we're using for fun.
Right.
It's a delicate question because again, like video games, it's an art form, and it's a unique way to make players feel guilt or pride and certain things that we are not going to feel if we're watching a movie. But because it's so powerful, with great power comes great responsibility. We have to think about, the ethical implications of those decisions.
Right. And what patterns have you noticed during your research? How players from different culture backgrounds experience video games?
So I haven't researched this actually. Um, so I cannot really give you a proper answer for
Hmm.
that. But what I can tell you anecdotally, for because I've been traveling a lot, and it's important that people are represented. It's important for them. It's important for diversity. It's important for inclusion, and it's important again to break those tropes that can be hurting certain populations for again no good reason, and the only reason is because there's a dominance in the way of thinking and a way of making games, and it's not really thought through. And
Hmm.
so that's why I'm really happy that the the video game industry is becoming more international, and now we play games from like Chinese games, and we play games from South Africa, and they're super interesting, and they're different, and that's great. It's also
Hmm.
bringing a different perspective, but also one that is more inclusive and is portraying the different cultures more accurately and not just through tropes.
Right.
So anecdotally, I can tell you that it's important that we have more diversity in the game industry so that we can stop just like, using those very use and abuse tropes. I think we're good now. We can we can go beyond that. It's time.
Finally, we had enough.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's always, sometimes it feels it's also the same story. So it was interesting to have a different, um, yeah, to have different stories and have games, fantasy games that are not based on Tolkien, for example. It's
Right.
interesting to get out of the format of Tolkien games. I see that I have unstable internet. Can you still hear me?
Yep.
Okay, cool. So yeah, no, that's why we need diversity, and this is going to happen anyway because the industry is booming in a lot of regions. Um,
Mhm.
so that's great. We're going to have more perspectives.
Do you think video games are part of the culture, or it's still an entertainment and business only model?
Oh no, there is definitely part of the culture. We use terms that game over, and no, it's definitely part of the culture. We reference a lot of games, like Mario is definitely part of the culture. Tetris, even Call of Duty, and
Right.
Fortnite, of course, now is part of culture, and Roblox, and all these games are, yeah, they're. It's definitely a cultural artifact. So yeah, there's not even a question about it. It is a part of a culture.
Part of the culture, right? But at the same time, despite the fact that it's a part of the culture, I totally agree with you. I'm evangelizing the gaming industry as much as possible, everywhere as possible. But we have this other part, the other trench of negativity,
Mhm.
despite the parenting. Also, we had this game addiction topic that is becoming very popular
Mhm.
on adult part, where they're thinking that the very recent survey shows that there are a lot of videos on social media with people claiming that it's the least desirable hobby that their partner could have.
Interesting. I was not aware of that survey. It's weird because third, more than a third of the planet is playing video games.
Right.
So yeah, I don't know. So I think part of it is a generational gap, as we saw with the radio and rock and roll and comic books. So I think part of it is happening with video games.
Mhm.
Um, I think there's a lot of misunderstanding still with the video game industry, but with there's so many people playing games today, and it's so much part of the culture, as you were mentioning, that it's at some point it's just going to be normalized, and you're not going to be pointed out if you're playing games or stigmatized. But that being said, we still need to look into our practice. And
Mhm.
because games are so popular, we also have a responsibility to look at, again, what tropes are perpetuating that could be
Yes.
affecting marginalized communities, and also what are the mechanics and systems that we're using to force a little bit players to come back or to punish them if they're not coming back. Yeah, I mean, all of these things we have to look into it, and that's why it's so difficult to separate the moral panics from the things that we are actually need to be better at. Because it's
Mhm.
hard. There's so many people that say, "Oh, video games are evil," and so
You're
what
right.
do you answer to that? People making games are passionate about games, and so it's they can't answer anything to that. But if we're looking down at the specific elements that are problematic, then it makes the discussion a little bit more uh, like easier to address.
More
So
grounded.
more grounded. At least we can move forward with
Yeah.
specific issues rather than, oh my god, this is bad. This is not. What can you do with that? It's not much.
Yeah, yeah. It's if I'm not mistaken, it's already 6 years ago that during the C4 conference, you've mentioned that like our brain is like a plastic, that it shapes with every information we are getting, and like video games is just another form of information that we are getting,
Yeah,
and it's not a topic to make it an evil. It's not a tool of evil. It's just another source of entertainment or culture. And
absolutely. We have research that is actually showing that it's has benefits. So it's not. again, we playing is very important for development, child development, also for adults. And video games are a form of play, and they also are
Mhm.
not forms. So there's a lot of interesting things about games.
The very recent thing is that another recent thing is because of the social media, because of the podcasts, because of the mental health issue became very, um, let's call it a popular topic around the world. A lot of people start to talk about the dopamine addictions with games or with adult movies and etc. etc. And the only way they're seeing it to reduce this dopamine addiction is to stop playing video games at all, do more exercises, um, go reading, do etc. etc. But not playing because it somehow affects to your, it triggers a lot of dopamine addiction. What do you think about it? Is it, does this theory even make a place?
Not from what I understand. The dopamine thing is very very overly exaggerated from people who don't understand dopamine or neuroscience overall. Um, yeah, so that's what I'm saying. There's those comments that I made are not representative of what we actually see. And dopamine is, I mean, this we know that dopamine is implied when there's addiction.
Mhm.
Um, but there's also dopamine when you're eating something or having sex or receiving something that you didn't, a reward that you didn't expect. And so this is not because you have a surge of dopamine in your brain that's necessarily going to create an addiction.
Hmm.
So even with drugs, with substance, we can't have a direct line that, oh, there's that surge of dopamine, this we know that this person is going to get addicted. We can't say that. um, so again, it's a lot of neuro bullshit. It's very common today. So you have stuff around dopamine, oxytocin, that crap.
Yeah.
I recently just saw an article of someone talking about games and naming me and then saying all that crap with dopamine and oxytocin. I'm like, oh my god, seriously. Um, so it's very common because it's a good narrative and people believe the narrative, and I mean we see that again and again. Something that sounds like it makes sense, and if you don't know about any of these things, it's just a narrative that makes sense and you're just going to buy into it. And it's really hard to combat this because the real narrative is it's complicated. Actually, it depends, and saying it depends and it's complicated is not as a good story as, yeah, dopamine is bad. That if you tell people, well, okay, but consider this: if you don't have enough dopamine, you can have a problems like Parkinson's is
Hmm.
the fact that your brain is not producing dopamine, and so you cannot move anymore. um, Dopamine is important. It's not just doing one thing, and it's important for learning. It's important for moving, and yes, in some cases, it's gonna be correlated with addiction.
Right.
But yeah, it's not as simple as people want
Imagine
it.
it. Yeah.
But it's a
Yeah,
good
but
story.
that's it.
Yeah.
Well, I mean,
It's
all you need to create, I mean, the whole point of the social media is now to get more views and more followers. And people
that's
can
the
create
problem.
absolutely
It's
very expensive
rewarding.
bullshit.
It's rewarding bullshit, yeah, and that's a big problem, as we can see today. I really don't know how to combat that, and it has deep implication not just for video games but also for societies and democracy.
Right.
So it's a deep, deep problem that we need to tackle. Because yeah, bullshit and sensationalism and pitting people against each other is good
Yeah.
business with social media. So We need to solve this somehow, otherwise it's not going to get any better.
What is your day-to-day responsibilities? What was your day-to-day responsibilities while you working with these companies like Ubisoft, Epic Games?
So it really depends on, like, towards the end of the end. It's not the end, but
Uh-huh.
the more advanced in my career I was,
Okay.
more my role was about building a UX strategy for the company,
Mm-hmm.
building a team and building having processes and a pipeline. So that was my role. Like, for example, at LucasArts, but didn't have the time to do much at Lucas, because Disney bought Lucas and closed down LucasArts. So I was just at LucasArts for a year and a half. But that was my role at Epic Games. Boot the UX team and make all that. Have a research team and have processes and also advocate for UX and explain what this
Mm-hmm.
is about. So that was my daily responsibility, and also help the teams with the games and help them make the right decisions.
Does that also include work with, for example, with narrative writers
Mhm.
and
Yeah,
designers
absolutely.
about shaping the storytelling for the video games?
Yeah, yeah, with everyone. So game designers were first in line, and I worked very closely with game designers, of course. But
Uh,
yeah, gameplay programmers and UI programmers and writers and artists, animators, sound designers, because they're always forgotten. But I worked with everyone because they're all taking part into shaping what's going to be the experience for players. So it's
mm,
important to make sure that all the pieces hold together and they are articulating in such a way that we're gonna hopefully offer the experience that we want to offer. So yeah,
mhm.
absolutely, yeah.
And
Every
I believe this is one of the reasons why during one of your interviews you tell that we need to appreciate video gaming more,
Yeah.
because the amount of people who are working years, sometimes with no weekends or offs.
Oh yeah, crunch is still very much alive.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's the thing also that I found very frustrating. Like, if only the public knew about how hard it is to make games and how passionate people are into making games, and all the sweat and tears that go into it. um yeah, they would have a different vision, hopefully, of the game industry. But that's also something that we need to address. We can't, it's, yeah, we're making fun stuff and an art form, but it's important to think about our physical health and mental health as we do so. So we also need to address this. When you
Right.
look within our troops and what we can do to solve this.
I believe it's more than a decade or two that you're in this industry already.
Yeah, it's been 15 years or so. I started at Ubisoft. It was in 20 and yeah, 2008, I think. So yeah, no, it was more
By the
than
way,
that. I don't know, but it was starting to be a long time now. Yeah.
and based on your experience, you're saying that multitasking is a myth,
Yeah, absolutely. Just
a
like
huge
dopamine.
one.
Yeah, we can't multitask. We think we can, but we can't. We cannot multitask efficiently unless we train
Okay.
ourselves for doing so. Like, when you learn how to drive a car, it's you have to multitask. You have to
Yeah.
move your hands and your feet at the same time as you look around and you navigate. That's multitasking. And as you learn how to drive, you're very bad at it. That's why there's always someone next to us that can just like break an emergency because we're not
Hmm.
good at this. So what we're gonna do is we train ourselves for the physical part, until it becomes automatic to drive a car and you don't think about it. When you don't think about it, it means that you don't pay attention to it. It comes naturally. So this is when you can actually really fully pay attention to what's going on around you in the street, and kids running and the dog crossing the street.
Hmm.
And so we can't multitask, but we can train ourselves into um, have one of the tasks automatic, so we can really fully direct our attention to something else. But if we try to divide our attention, it's very, very um, uh, extremely increasing the errors that we can make. And
Hmm.
so if we try to do two things at the same time, like if I was listening to your question and then at the same time reading my email because, oh, I'm busy, I want to read my email and just listen to you, there's a very good chance that I'm going to miss something, and then you're going to ask me, hey, what do you think? And I'll be like, can you repeat the question? And again, we feel that we are good at doing this, but we're getting busted very easily. And so it's a myth. We cannot really truly multitask efficiently without making mistakes and missing out on some information. So sometimes it's not a big issue if you're listening to a podcast and reading your emails at the same time. Yes, you're gonna miss out on stuff in the podcast, but no harm done, I guess.
Hmm.
But if you're trying to do two things at the same time as you drive, for example, this can be a life or death situation. So there are situations that is much more important to understand that we can't multitask, and others are, yeah, you're gonna make some errors, and it's not the end of the world. So we have to think about that in games, so that when we place players in a multitasking situation, we know that we are doing this, and it's part of the challenge that we want for players. It cannot be an afterthought. So we have to try to carefully think about the cognitive load that we think, this is how we call it, that we put on players, especially at the very beginning of the game, because this is when players have to learn about so many things. So their attention is already all over the place.
All right. But do you think, in a psychological and neuroscience perspective, if someone doing this type of heavy microtasking during playing video games, like, for example, very recent example with a very deep and dark multitasking system, Diablo 4,
Mhm.
where you need to click as much keyboard combination as possible if you want to survive. Do you think that crafting and honing your skills in video games can actually help you in your real life to handle these type of situations more better way, or is just the same multitasking myth going over and over?
Yeah, so this is what we call transfer
Okay.
in psychology. If you learn about something in a game, you get better at it in the game. So, of course, in Diablo, you're going to get better at doing this. But does this transfer to other parts of
Layers.
your life? So, in a different situation, in a real life situation, there are very little research that is showing transfer from video games to something else. We do have transfer of abilities from action video games
Hmm.
in terms of visual attention. So that's
Hmm.
a very, it was actually published in Nature. It's a very well known study by Green and Bevelier that showed that if you train players to certain games, so they train players on Medal of Honor and then on other games, they showed that they use a pre-test and post-test to measure a visual attention. So it's a test when you have to follow dots like moving and then they disappear, and then you have to say, like, you have, for example, a yellow dot among a lot of dots and they're all moving, and then the yellow disappears and they're all white, and then you have to at the end show this is where it is now. So it's a measure that we have to look at visual attention. And they proved that if you train people on a game like Medal of Honor, where you do have to follow different targets and try to understand where people are, it is transferring to this test that we have to measure visual attention. So I'm not aware. of the situation that you're talking about, because we would need to test it. And so far,
Hmm.
we don't have a lot of research that is showing transfer of competence. But to be fair, it's not just in video games. We also do not have a lot of transfer from if you play a lot of chess, for example, from
Right.
math skills. So it's not just video games. It's actually pretty hard to measure and demonstrate transfer of skills from one situation, a gaming
Hmm.
situation, to real life. So maybe, as far as I know, there's no research showing this in terms of multitasking, but it could be. But we have to be careful with those claims, because a lot of people
Hmm.
are saying this and that. Oh, video games, they're training your brain and blah blah blah, and this is exaggerated as well. So this might be
Same way that they're talking about Elon Musk's recent AI developments, right? They're trying
all right.
to
Like you're
make you
okay. You're moving
robots.
your ears. I did not expect Elon Musk dropping in the conversation. I have thoughts on Elon Musk, but you don't want to hear it right now. It's like you're gonna
Go
lose me
ahead.
if you put me on the on the Elon Musk thing. Like I'm gonna be very like yeah,
No, there are a
very
lot of ethical concerns about what he's building with these microchip designs and stuff, but it's a completely other
I
topic of
do have
discussion,
concerns
right?
actually about what he's doing, and
Uh,
yeah, because they're anyway. This is not the point of the podcast here, but there are concerns because he doesn't care about regulations, just like Trump doesn't care. And so he's been doing a lot of things, move fast and break things. The promises, some of the things that you can break are really damaging certain people. So I
mm,
love technology, and there's a lot of things that are can be exciting, like AI or spaceship, but not if it's not serving everyone. And the problem with a lot of tech people today, they care about their community, and they don't necessarily think about how the technology can hurt marginalized folks,
mhm,
as we see, and it is very well established that AI is going to perpetuate discrimination. Um,
mm,
so I do have concerns, and it's really important to again, um, technology is exciting, but it has to serve humans and all humans, not just a subcategory of humans. So if
mm.
we don't ensure that this is the case, it's not innovation to me. And of course, if you're part of the group that is not affected by discrimination by those tools, you don't really care, and that's a problematic to me. But
I mean,
anyway,
it's the world
all to say
problem.
that transfer is difficult to accomplish with, and so we cannot really say that games are the devil, but we cannot also say that games are the solution to everything and they're gonna save the world, because some people say that, and we also do not have strong evidence to support this. So we have to
What,
have a balanced view of everything.
right? What are your like future plans in video games ethic? For like, what are the upcoming research that you're planning to do?
So I don't do a lot of research. I discuss with a lot of researchers, and I
Mm,
participate in certain things. But I'm not. I do not consider myself a researcher anymore. Yeah, the big part of my work today is the Ethical Games Initiative. So we'll see where we're going with that. So it's taking me a lot of time, but I also want to make sure that we can keep the Game UX Summit alive and kicking. But it's yeah, it's I like time, and I so I need to figure out how we can do everything. But yeah, that's yeah, I think advocacy and make people think about ethics and inclusion, and how technology can actually serve everyone and not just subcategory people. These are the things that I really care about. So that would be, besides from my consulting work, because I this is what I do on a daily basis. I consult with companies to help them with their games, and I train people or do UX evaluations on games, and
mhm.
provide us guidance. So this is what I do for a living and on my spare time. I try to push forward advocacy in UX and game UX and do the ethical game stuff. But
When it comes to consultancy for these video game companies, does it
Mhm.
also include like neuroscientifical point of view for the video games that they're building,
Not
or
really.
you're just
No, not really. So first of all, I'm not a neuroscientist. I'm a cognitive
cognitive
psychologist. So
psychologist?
yeah, I know enough to say that dopamine crap needs to stop, but it's not my the core of my expertise. So no, I actually don't consult on neuroscience. I consult on kind of science, and mostly I
UX.
consult on game UX. So
Hmm.
stuff around usability and engageability and pipeline and so stuff like that. This is what I do.
Daily basis.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, and it's enough. You actually don't need any neuroscience stuff to. It's not bringing enough for now, and it's really complicated to figure it out. We don't understand it well enough right now to use it efficiently, unless you're working on health tech or on a game, to treat ADHD. Then in that case, yes, it makes sense, but not for regular games.
But about the video gaming psychology and about how video gaming companies, are telling the stories, most of the time, taking even examples like military shooting games, because they're great examples, because the first aspect that people see is just you as a player shooting around, destroying the buildings, cars, etc. But most of the
Mhm.
times, even this type of games had a story like under the lines about some connections, sibling connections, military brotherhood, for example, or anything else. And yeah, there is this hidden message, and how one as a player can start catching this type of messages, because it's also designed by UX part also, because you're showing one thing, but under the hood there's completely other story that people can feel.
Mhm. That's an interesting question. I don't think it's necessarily going to happen, and I think we have to be okay with that. You have a lot of people who are going to consume an art form and not necessarily really get to the deep meaning of it. Like,
Mm,
it's just you still have people like using the Matrix to
right.
convey like anti-trans messages, and you're like, do you understand what the Matrix is about? And so a lot of people don't necessarily get to the core of the message, um, and I don't think art has to make sure people get at the core of the message. Arts should
Mm,
be there to move lines and to make people think about the world differently. Um, but a lot of people are gonna miss the point. And yeah, I'm not sure if this is something that we really have to ensure. If it's a message that is really core to the experience, maybe we can test if people get the point. But you're still not gonna have people just gonna play the game and shoot at stuff just for the fun of it, and I think that's
yeah.
okay. It doesn't have to necessarily. Yeah, I don't know. Yeah,
So
it's an interesting question. It's an interesting question. I do care about video games that have a message, and I love those games. But yeah, it's not necessarily going to happen. Like the message is not necessarily going to be conveyed, and I think we should be okay with that.
at least not for everyone. It's one thing for the core fan base who can create even a couple of hour videos explaining all of the uh, hidden
Yeah, and it's always
storytellings. It's
been. Yeah, it's always going to be the case. Like some people are just going to watch a movie or play a game, to have a good time, and others really gonna be super interested in the lore and exploring everything. And yeah, I think there is room for both of these ways of consuming entertainment.
By the way, another question about the UX. I discussed this question with narrative writer David Gallagher on the last episode about how narrative writers, from his perspective, are using Campbell's hero's journey and Jung's theories of collective unconscious. My question to you is like how these gigantic chapters of human history influence the storytelling frameworks in modern
Hmm.
media. Like, why
Yeah.
do you think that like this timeless? It's basically a timeless pattern that resonates deeply with the audience today. Like, doesn't matter if it's like repeated dozens, millions of times. It's still got this resonating feeling with the audience.
Yeah, so there actually, I'm not a narrative designer,
No, no,
so
no. I
don't
know,
ask
I
me
know.
more about this.
No, no,
Uh,
I'm asking
yeah,
from
yeah, but
UX
there are,
perspective.
yeah, but there are different models. But yeah,
Yeah.
the Campbell's Hero's Journey is very popular in the West, and so yeah, you do have a lot that are just copy pasting the framework. It's it's familiar, and I guess there's something good about familiarity because it makes it easier to approach. And then you can make it a little bit different. Like if you're talking about Campbell, of course, I'm gonna think about
Yep.
George Lucas. And Lucas, because he was very much into Campbell's work. But Lucas really wanted to, like in Star Wars, making a entirely different world, but that was familiar.
Mm.
So I think by using those frameworks that today are familiar, you can make sure that the audience, uh, are more comfortable with it, and then you can introduce some differences, something new that it's easier to absorb because again, we're all very busy people, and if you watch a movie like Tenet, like I really,
Hmm.
I really like those type of movies, but you have to be in a good mindset, and if you're tired after your day and you watch a movie like this, like Inception or Tenet, I mean, it's it's not that easy. So it's just allowing, I guess it's allowing to more people to be able to absorb new concepts if you have a framework that is already familiar. But you
Right.
have other types of frameworks that are super interesting as well, but they're probably not as approachable, and so it's not always easy. Again, you need to be in a specific mindset to watch certain movies, because you know that you have to think through certain things, and you have to have the broader aspect. Or
Right.
so yeah, I don't know if it's a good answer to your question, but I
It's
guess
more.
it's priority.
Yeah. What is the most common UX mistake that you see in modern video game design?
Thinking about it too late. That's the number one most common problem, that people think they can UX the game at some point instead of
Hmm.
approaching UX as a mindset and a strategy. And so I am very often called too late. Like I'm called when the
Mm.
game is in beta and I'm asked to do an evaluation of it. And I'm like, sure, I can do it, but it's very likely I'm gonna find some issues, and it's gonna be too late to really solve those issues in a very meaningful way. So there's that idea that UX is just a step in the process instead of
Hmm.
being a way to approach a process. It's very, very common.
Oh, wow. And can you share an example of a game where UX had a direct impact on its success or failure? Do you have anything in mind?
Yeah, I can talk about Fortnite. It's just I'm not going to talk about failure because it's harsh, and it's, I mean, it's a bit pretentious to say, oh, they didn't think about the UX and this
Right.
is why they failed. It's not my place to say that. But for sure, I mean, for sure, from my perspective, and I'm absolutely not biased, like the work that we did on Fortnite was very UX centered, and the core team was like super into it, and we worked very closely together. It was really interesting, and we it allowed us to see problems early enough and then try to solve for it.
Mhm.
So I would say, but of course, I'm sure people would disagree. But from my perspective, the UX mindset on Fortnite was a key part of its success. But of
Mhm.
course, it's all a matter of perspective, and this is just my opinion. It's probably a bit biased, um, but I would say, for sure, if you have a UX approach, it's definitely gonna help you and not gonna put some obstacles. Because sometimes people think,
Mhm.
yeah, but I don't want to know what's going wrong with the game early on because yeah, I know it's not working and I don't want to have any of this negativity. Yeah, it is hard to confront yourself to the game that you're hoping to make and seeing that it's not actually what's happening. But the earlier you know when you explore this, the better you can fix it at a moment where it's cheaper to fix. um, so I'm not saying that if you have a UX approach, definitely your game is going to be successful, but it's increasing the likeliness for you to find that perfect recipe for your game because we don't apply any recipe,
Mhm.
but we have ingredients. And so hopefully if you you look early enough about what's going on with your game, you're going to be more likely to find the perfect recipe for your game rather than if you design in a silo and not want to look at what's going wrong with it and you wait until it's too late, then it's going to be much more difficult to recover from that if you started on the wrong track.
I see. Will this be like that one piece of UX wisdom you wish that every game developer knew?
Yeah. Again, I would say making games is hard, and I
Sure.
know that so many things are key to make a great game. But if you place yourself in a situation where you put the humans playing the game at the center of what you do, you're not only maybe going to explore some things that you didn't think of. That's going to make your
Mhm.
game even more interesting. But also, it's um, it's going to allow you to see where your game is failing to do what you were hoping it would do early enough for you to correct it.
Mhm.
Um, so yeah, UX is life.
Wow. I mean, yeah, it is. It's totally like real life situation, basically. That's why it's called user experience in the first place. If we see a good UX on not even in a game, right? It can be even iPhone usage, for example.
Mhm.
If it's easy to use, if there is a good UX, you will alter to like keep on it, and you don't even think about to use anything else because the brain is
Yeah,
getting
UX is
familiar very quickly. Yeah, and your brain is getting familiar very quickly. If it triggers in the first couple of minutes at max, then that's it, right?
yep. Yeah, yeah, yeah. It's all about UX is all about shifting your perspective and to make sure that
Mhm.
what you're trying to accomplish with your game or product is in effect what's going on with the people using the product. So yeah, it's always a good exercise to verify that what you're doing is actually accomplishing what you wanted to accomplish,
Mhm.
rather than have those hopes and dreams. This is gonna work.
What about we had a very quick chat about AI. With advancements in AI and VR, and we
Mhm.
can see there are a lot of protests against AI from voice actors, from actors right now. How do you see UX design evolving in next decade with these tools coming in the first place and taking, like not taking, but being very popular and getting a massive recognition?
Yeah. It's an interesting question, and it's difficult to answer because of all the moving pieces right now.
Hmm.
Definitely, artists are concerned about the use of generative AI to replace them, because this is what's going on, and replace them with generative AI that's been trained on their assets. So it's like, yeah, it's of course creating a lot of problems. How is this going to impact UX? I've already seen some companies that are telling people you don't need to do any user research. We have that UI tool that is pretending to be all the different users so that you can see if it's efficient or not. This is a fallacy because the AI is only going to be able to reproduce past patterns and past behaviors in certain
Mm.
contexts for certain things. It's very unlikely that this is going to work for your new game or your new product on different people, and so that idea that we can just like use a template and have a recipe is really not what UX is
Hmm.
about. But a lot of people don't know that, and that's why UX designers don't get the design right in the first time. That they need to iterate because every situation is different. Every game is going to be different, and you can't.
Mm.
There are things you can maybe anticipate from past practice and past games that you worked on, definitely. But you still need to test with real people to verify that your hypotheses are true. And so I fear that because it's easier and cheaper to use AI tools like this to pretend that you don't need any user research anymore, people are just not gonna find out the issues of their game or not gonna be able to innovate because again, AI is trained on past experiences, so you're not gonna be able to innovate with a tool that's been trained with behaviors that were prior to the introduction of a new
Right.
technology, for example. So this is not going to
But
work.
in
But
video
there are
gaming industry, we have you have a player feedback, even in on very early stages. That is part of the game development, right?
yeah,
You have a dedicated players that serve
in
as like
in big studios, yes.
QAs. Yeah.
Not in all studios, but in the biggest studios, yes. You have a playtest lab, and it's as important as the QA lab.
Oh, I see. But how the indie studios are handling this situation?
Yeah, so for indie developers, it's of course harder because they don't have the infrastructure to easily do playtest sessions.
Hmm.
Um, so there are different things that they can do. They can do smaller tests, like more like do it yourself kind of a thing. It's better to try to put it together and do a smaller test rather than not doing a test at all. The biggest issue is they don't necessarily have the means to hire UX researcher, and so they can
Hmm.
introduce biases in their research if they conduct the research by themselves. So that's a risk because bad data is worse than no data. But if they have a little bit of training on the biases and how to run an experiment and are able to ensure that the research is really going to measure what they want to measure, they
Hmm.
can have good results and get insights from their research, even though they
Hmm.
don't have a big lab. Um, and
Hmm.
it's going to teach them a lot of stuff on their games. And I've worked with indie developers, and I mean, all of them are always saying that how doing the playtest was very eye opening and also gave them ideas for the game that they didn't think of before watching players interact with the game. So I understand that it's um, an investment
Hmm.
to run a playtest, but it's definitely going to be an investment that's going to be useful and very insightful for your game. So think about it early enough so that you can make sure that when you do play tests like this as an indie developer, you can get the maximum insights out of it. And there's a lot of user researchers that are students and want to get into the industry that you can, hire to help you out. And that's going to be cheaper than the playtest labs. But if you have the means to hire a playtest lab that is external,
Mhm.
do it, because it's definitely going to bring you a lot of insights. But depending on your means and the budget that you have, there are always things that you can do. It's not going to be necessarily the state of the art user research, but there's always something that you can do that's going to be useful for you.
Right. Speaking about those people who want to learn more about UX, my first question will be: are you planning to do like a course for people who want to learn UX from you directly,
I already do that.
or?
Yeah, I do a lot of master classes. It's not always public because it depends on the time that I have. But during the
Mhm.
pandemic, I did a lot of these master classes online for the public, and I oftentimes do it at certain um, conferences. Like
Mhm.
DEFCON is an example of
Yep.
that. I'm usually every year at DEFCON, and I give a master class on game UX or on motivation and explain all that. So this is a big part of what I do actually. But most of the time, I am hired by a studio to give a training to within the studio.
Mhm.
When
Within
I
the
have
studio.
time, I offer master classes that are public. I do that very regularly in France, actually, because I work with a training company that is
Mhm.
regularly, like twice a year, usually running those master classes. But yeah,
What's the name of the company?
it's Gameste. Actually, I'm going to do it again in Paris in late December and in Lyon in early January. So I do that regularly,
Mhm.
um, but not necessarily online. I used to do it online publicly a lot during the pandemic, but now I'm moving a lot, so it's a little bit more
Mm.
complicated for me to organize. But if people tell me, hey, we would like you to organize it, and if they tell me what time zone they're in, and there are at
Mhm.
least 10 people interested, I'm happy to run a master class online for those who want it. So just don't
Wow.
hesitate to contact me. Um,
Are there any like must-read literature for those who want to jump into
yes,
the
it's all
industry?
on my website. If you go to
Right.
celiahodent.com/slash
Yeah.
resources, you will find most of them. I've been very bad lately at updating the reading list, but most of the things you need to read, or the websites you need to go to, or the communities you can join,
Mhm.
it's on there.
And last two questions. I don't want to like be that guy who's
It's a
spamming
long
with a lot of
podcast.
questions. Sorry for that. I want to know. You wrote multiple very influential books, as I told, and what is your creative process like? Do you draw more from your research, or it's a real world gaming or life examples?
Um, it's well, a lot of it is from my practice, and a lot of it is from research that other people did. So I usually, for my books, I usually feed on both. It's
Mm.
very important because I come from academia. It's very important for me that everything I say is backed as much as possible by studies. So there's a lot of there's a big part of it coming from science, and there's also a big part of it coming from my practice on games or people I consult with. It's a bit harder for me now to showcase a game because
Mhm.
it's as an external consultant. It's always a bit more complicated to talk about certain things. But yeah, it's both of these aspects.
What about the feedbacks? What's the most unexpected feedback you've received
From players or from video?
about your books
Oh,
or work?
I mean, I forget about the bad feedback.
I'm
No,
talking about general unexpected one,
and
but it can be a
I don't.
good one.
I mean, it's always unexpected for me when, like, just like you said at the opening of the podcast, that it's very influential. Like, it's always surprising to me, in a good way, and I always very honored to hear that. But yeah, I have people contacting me on LinkedIn, on Blue Sky, or before that on Twitter, but I'm not on Twitter anymore. Who just like randomly like say, "Hey, I just wanted to say thank you for the book," and it's always very kind, and I'm always very surprised that the books are so impactful. So I'm very thankful for it. I'm very honored for it, and I love all these messages. It's always humbling to receive those messages, um, and yeah, I'm so proud that it's really impacting people as much. That's surprising.
Yeah, it's true. It is true.
Well, I'm glad, but it is still surprising to me.
And it became more and more surprising. Are you planning new books? Any new
Yes.
books coming?
So yeah, it's really hard for me to work on books right now because the world is a little bit chaotic. I have a lot of
I know.
stuff to work on and the ethical game stuff. I'm currently working on the second edition of the Gamer's Brain.
Hmm.
So this is what I'm doing right now. I'm gonna also have to work on the second edition of the Psychology of Video Games because there are new research that I need to update in this book. No. So I need to work on that first, and then yeah, there are a few books that I'm thinking of. I don't want to talk about it right now because it's still not. But yeah, I
Totally
definitely
understandable. Yeah.
I definitely want to write more books. It's interesting to write books because it's it's helping me organize my thoughts. um, yeah, and I love writing because you're confronted to your own weaknesses and strength, and it's really hard, to express something and find the way to express it in a way that is going to be both interesting and approachable. But I love this exercise, but it's difficult. It's painful to do. It requires a lot of energy and time.
Yeah. Yeah, it is. Well, thank you so much for your time. It was
My
an
pleasure.
absolute pleasure to have you here today. Thank you for answering to all these interesting questions.
I
For
tried.
me,
I
at
tried to answer
least.
the best I could. Some questions were difficult or tricky, but yeah, I hope I hope I did a good job at answering them.
Uh,
There are definitely a lot of them were very thoughtful. So I was like, okay, how am I going to answer this one? It's good.
well,
It's a good exercise.
I've been inspired by your books, so no judgment. I've tried my best. Thank
Oh,
you
I
very
mean,
much
it's
again.
difficult. It's difficult to ask questions. Like, definitely, it's not easy. So good job.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for demystifying this dopamine bullshit also.
Yeah, there's so much bullshit out there. Like, we need to clean the world. It's like it's
Right.
stinky.
It is, and it's our job to clean it.
Someone has to do it. Well, thank you so
Thank
much.
you.
And yeah, don't hesitate for those listening. Don't hesitate to poke me on LinkedIn or Blue Sky. I'm not always good at answering right away because it depends if of my situation at the moment I receive the message. But I usually try to answer to everyone. So don't hesitate to poke me and to poke me again if I'm taking a time